Welcome to French History. Okay, so as usual, make sure you've got quiet space, you've got some highlighter pens, you've got your book in case you want to refer to it. You need the worksheet printed off or to access electronically, and there is also an information sheet with this lesson. So the first thing I want you to do is just think to yourself for a few seconds, what do you think this image shows? What do you think could be happening here? And the title of this image, which is a bit faint on the bottom, is The Journée, 10th August 1792. So you might be thinking you can see lots of people, you can see soldiers, you can see members of the National Guard, but you can also see other individuals in red, which were the Swiss Guard. You can see some definite violence going on, and you can see a big building in the background, which you may know is the Tuileries. Okay, so if you thought that this was another violent attack and event in the French Revolution, you were right. This is the event which ultimately brings down the monarchy in August 1792. Okay, so today's lesson is looking at these events in the summer of 1792 and the collapse of the constitutional experiment in these months. Okay, so we want to think about this word journée, what does it mean? And we want to describe what happened between June and September in 1792 and how that brought down the monarchy. And ultimately we want to start analysing why this was happening by thinking about why had the influence of the radical left increased by 1792? Why did they have much more influence than they had the previous summer when they'd had similar ideas about removing Louis? Okay, so task one, and you can do this on your worksheet or you can do it on a piece of paper, is a quick recap of the chronology. So I'll just give you a few minutes to put these in chronological order. So you can put a letter starting with 1 for the first event to 5 for the last event next to each one. So pause the video now and try from memory to put these events in chronological order. Okay, so the first one was the death of Mirabeau, and we said this was instrumental in the radicalisation of politics because he was like a bridging kind of character between the people in the revolution that wanted change. You know, he was one of the leaders of the Third Estate in the original Estates General and the monarchy, and his death was sort of instrumental in the flight to Varennes, wasn't it? Which is when the king thought that he was basically a prisoner and he needed to flee. After that, we know we had the Champenois massacre when there was a demonstration asking for the king to be put on trial, which ended in a massacre of 50 people. And because of the increased sort of criticism and threats to the king and the fact that he'd been brought back to Paris, you had the involvement of other countries such as Austria issuing threats to the revolutionaries if the king's put in danger, the Declaration of Pilnitz, and that provoked a whole debate on war in France, which ultimately ended in France going to war in April 1792. Okay, so that was the correct order, just a bit of a recap of what we've got to store in the story so far. Okay, so we just want to introduce this new key term, journée. So if you know any French, you'll know that journée means day, but what does this mean in the context of the revolution? If you have a little look at the pictures on the right, you might begin to get some ideas here. All of the pictures on the right could be called journées. They're events that we've already studied so far. Okay, so if you were thinking that they're all involving people, you were right. Okay, so journée in the context of the French Revolution refers not just to any day, but to a revolutionary day, a day when the mob took action which had an impact on the course of the revolution. It drove the revolution. So just have a little think to yourself, what journées have happened in the French Revolution so far? There's at least 3 examples that are really significant that are depicted in these images here. See if you can just think to yourself what any of them might have been. Okay, so the storming of the Bastille, the original journée, the historic day in France, the symbolic day of ordinary people challenging the monarchy. The October days in the second picture, really important. You know, it showed that ordinary people could basically bring the monarchy back and put them in Paris and and the monarchy was subject to the people's will. And the protests at the Champ de Mars massacre, perhaps a less successful journey in terms of they didn't get what they wanted, and we'll be coming to that a little bit later in the lesson, but certainly it was an action of a popular action in taking place, wasn't it? Okay, so in the summer of 1792, it would be a series of more journeys, bigger journeys, that would ultimately bring down the monarchy and create a new republican state in France by September. Okay, so task 2, the big task, the main task of today's lesson, is to use the information sheet, and there is a video clip to go with the middle one, it's only a few minutes, to find out about these 3 events and fill in your worksheet to say what was the context and what actually happened, what were the outcomes, and what was kind of going on in this sort of external context, so things to do with the war and kind of sort of context to these particular things that are happening in France. Okay, so I want you to pause the video now, find the other information sheet, fill in the grid. I imagine this will take you a good 15 minutes, and then come back to restart the video and go through the answers. Okay, so let's have a little bit of a talk about this. So, we could say that definitely, you know, perhaps there was a symbolism in the 20th of June being the anniversary of the tennis court oath, the 4th anniversary of the tennis court oath, and 8,000 sans-culottes. That's a lot, isn't it? You know, and some members of the National Guard marched to the Tuileries and demand Louis withdraw his vetoes. Remember, he was trying to veto legislation against refractory priests and against disbanding his own army in favour of the Fédérés, and to restore pro-war ministers, the Brissotins or the Girondins, people like Roland, who he'd had in his cabinet until he dismissed them over this very issue of the veto. And they very embarrassingly made him wear the bonnet rouge and offered a toast to the nation, and then they were persuaded to go home by Pétion. So this really annoyed Lafayette, who wanted action against these protesters. Okay, so you're beginning to see a real divisioning opening up between the sans-culottes and the assembly here. It's a kind of battle of wills, isn't it? One's on the side of the monarchy, albeit reluctantly, but one's on the side of republicanism. But ultimately, we've got this kind of foreign policy context, haven't we, which I'll come on to in a minute. But because of the war, you've got discussion and more talk of Louis being a traitor and Louis not being a supporter of the revolution. Vergnard, one of the Girondins, said that Louis had abdicated his royal office and should be forced to step down. So coming on to the war, the Army of the North and the French army is in retreat, and because of that, you can see in the column on the right hand side here, they issue this decree, La Patrie en danger. Okay, so it's sort of saying that everybody needs to join together. So you get a sense that France is feeling under real threat at this point. They're feeling really insecure. It's an insecurity about being invaded, but it's also an insecurity about who they can trust in their own midst back at home, isn't it? And this definitely wasn't helped by the Brunswick Manifesto, saying that when the Prussian army invaded, nobody would be given any quarter, and anybody that gave harm to any National Guardsman would be put to death without mercy, and Paris would suffer vengeance. Okay, so that kind of threat, a little bit like the Declaration of Pillnitz, didn't improve the situation. And Robespierre wades in as well, himself saying that France should become a republic. So you're beginning to see, this alliance between the Jacobins and the Cordeliers and the Sans-Culottes and the Paris Commune really cementing itself in 1792, and that's the crucial element here, is that they're getting a lot of influence by joining together. Okay, so on the 10th of August. There was 20,000 sans-culottes marching on the Tuileries, okay, and 2,000 of these fédérés that had come to Paris from the provinces that were really sort of riled up with revolutionary fervour. The some of the National Guard, again, joined them from the more revolutionary Paris sections. Remember, we said the sections were these little councils for the different regions of Paris that were dominated by your kind of working class people, your shopkeepers, your waged labourers, people like that. And there was a big battle, and basically lots of the guards defending it, the Swiss Guard, were all massacred. And Louis is forced to flee. Now, as you'll see at the end of this lesson, I have put the link to the video that we've been watching in class, and there's a really good scene making this come a lot more to life than I've described it there. Okay, so this is the event that we saw in the picture right at the start. It's the National Guard, the Fédérés, and the sans-culottes marching on the Tuileries, basically attacking the king, which is, you can't get more radical than that, and that's why this event's been called the Second Revolution by some people. Okay, so the king flees to the assembly. He throws himself on their mercy, but he's put in the Temple prison just north of the Seine in Paris, and he is removed by the Paris Commune. The assembly here are really weak. A lot of the more moderates flee, and the Jacobins are now left in the majority, and the king is temporarily suspended. Okay, a little bit later on they do kind of end the monarchy formally, but it's not till a little bit later on that the king is put on trial. Okay, so they're promising a new constitution called the Convention, which will be universal elections, universal franchise. Okay, so they're throwing their lot in with the sans-culottes here, and this is when we sort of see the rise of some of these more radical politicians. Danton makes himself Minister of Justice, and a lot of the things that they had objected to that Louis did against these refractory priests, and the suspensory veto, are all kind of done away with. The compensation to the seigneurs is done away with, and we're beginning to see the first tribunals, these judges and juries elected by the sections to prosecute traitors. They'll be really important later on in the Terror, so more on that later on. So Lafayette doesn't take this lying down, and don't forget Lafayette is in the army. He has got troops at his disposal, so he attempts to march on Paris to restore the constitution, to object to this popular action to get rid of Louis, but he does not have the support to do it in terms of numbers, and he turns back and defects to the Austrians. Okay, so constitutional monarchy is pretty much at an end by the end of August, but ultimately the war is still going on, and it's on the 25th of August that news reaches Paris that Longwy has fallen. On the 1st of September, Verdun is under siege, and so there's complete crisis going on. They're not far away. They're weeks away from marching into Paris, and as we know, there'd already been this threat that everybody would be put to death, or the revolution would be put to death if the foreign invaders got there. So there's complete hysteria, and I think in this context we see some real weakness going on, because the revolutionary sort of radicals, the left, people like Danton in particular, don't do anything. In fact, they just kind of endorse the violence. So they ring the Tocsin bell, and when that happens, lots of prisoners in the jails are killed. Okay, these prisoners are supposedly the enemies of the revolution, because prior to this, that he'd authorised that lots of houses be searched and weapons looked for, and lots of people be called up and conscripted on pain of death, and anybody that's any kind of got any links to any aristocrats or any of sort of enemies of the state is kind of a target for this. But ultimately, when they go into these prisons and sort of massacre the people inside, it's just pure bloodletting, really. They're just massacring people that could be there for any reason, and monks and nuns tend to be a big victim of this. And you have this kind of horrendous sort of phenomenon called the baveurs de sang. You can Google that if you want. So the baveurs de sang were the drinkers of blood, and this wasn't even just made up thing. There were reportedly some of these sans-culottes going around the prisons in the September massacres who were not only drinking the blood of their victims but were just sort of eating gunpowder to enhance their fiery spirits. So the Fédérés are definitely involved in massacring in this context as well. This is going to have a big impact. This shows that the excesses that the sans-culottes were capable of, and some of the Jacobins, particularly the Girondin faction, the Brissotins, remember that there's kind of like this separate group, the representatives of the provinces, and we will talk huge amounts more about this after half term. They are quite unhappy about this this behaviour of the sans-culottes. They are not on board with this this bloodletting that's going on, and it sort of showed that there was a danger to this alliance with the sans-culottes. There's a danger, but there was also a power to it, because the Robespierre and Danton are increasingly looked to as the leaders, but that comes at a price, at giving into popular kind of hysteria and the popular will, I guess, which is, you know, kind of why the terror ends up happening. So, ironically, as we can see in the final column here, you have all this kind of hysteria and this this complete chaos in the fears that they're going to be invaded in days and weeks. But actually, on the 20th of September, it's not really a decisive victory, but it's not a defeat at Valmy. Actually means that all of that hysteria is for nothing, and they aren't invaded, and the revolution continues. So if it hadn't been for that, if they actually had lost at Valmy, then this could have all been a very quick and violent set of incidences. But because of that, we've got rid of the monarchy, and yet the revolution and the convention that they've promised remains. Okay, so it says on your worksheet, highlight examples of the king's actions, the actions of the radical politicians, the actions of the sans-culottes and the Fédérés, and the influence of war. And this is going to be important for us in our next live lesson, where we're talking about what role each of those factors played and how they were linked together in causing the end of constitutional monarchy. Okay, so I'm not going to go through that, but you can pause the video and just spend a bit of time highlighting your notes on that for 5 minutes or so now. So something that you may have heard of, that's one of the most gruesome sort of examples of this, and it is depicted really horridly on the video again, is that this was when the Princess de Lamballe, the Queen's best friend, was supposedly massacred in the streets, and, you know, kind of her body was mutilated. This is kind of an event that's sort of gone down in sort of popular urban legend, really. There's possibly not very much historical evidence of this having taken place, but we can see that, you know, these events in September 1792, this is the high point so far of the excesses of violence, isn't it? You know, we have had killing, haven't we? Like when they stormed the Bastille, but it was small numbers of individuals. This is kind of bloodletting on a large scale here. And this can help us, remember last time we were talking about the British depictions of the sans-culottes, this can help us explain that. And this cartoon in particular, relaxing after the fatigues of their day, from September 1792, does make a lot more sense now, doesn't it? Because you can see them, you know, they're eating the remains of the people they're attacking, not just the adult sans-culottes, even the kids are just on the floor. They're barbarians, aren't they? They are not civilized, they're ruthless, they're fanatical, they are not to be argued with. Okay, so moving on to task 3. So a key part to this is to sort of think, well, why had the Journées of the summer of 1792 been successful then? Because a year before there had been huge numbers of people marching to the Champ de Mars demanding the king's removal. Why suddenly now have they managed to achieve this? What's changed? Okay, so I want you to think back to the Champ de Mars massacre and think about the three events that we've just studied and try and complete this Venn diagram recording the similarities and differences. So if you've not done a Venn diagram before, the similarities you put in the middle and then differences you put on the outside. So for example, by 1792 France was at war, whereas in 1791 France was not at war. Okay, so pause the video now, spend 5 minutes or so coming up with at least 2 or 3 ideas in each of these sections of the Venn diagram. Okay, so let's go through some possible answers. Okay, so we could say that they're both violent clashes, aren't they? So they're clashes with lots of, mob violence is kind of like the defining feature of both of them. Okay, and we could also say that both of these events were kind of influenced by the radical left. Politicians like Marat, Hébert, Danton, Robespierre. I haven't put all the names on there. Okay, so they're not purely spontaneous, are they? There is an element of organisation here through the sections, through the Cordelier Club, influenced by the radical incendiary press, and the Jacobins, who are on the same side at this point. So there's an influence of the mob, but there's also leaders, isn't there? Okay, so let's come to some differences then. So at the Champ de Mars massacre, the National Guard, led by Lafayette and Bailly, who was mayor of Paris at this point and in charge of the Paris Commune, they fired upon the demonstrators, who then dispersed, didn't they? And 50 of them were killed, which is quite a small number comparatively. Whereas in the context of worse economic conditions and this poor harvest in 1791 and food prices going up by something like 50%, the National Guard, and in the context of the war and this threat of invasion, the sans-culottes seem to have a lot more influence, don't they? And they are joined by these National Guardsmen who are sympathetic to their views about the getting rid of the monarchy, and they've been infiltrated by these radicalised volunteers from the provinces, these fédérés. Now, the way they would have not existed, would they, had the war not happened? And we could say that in the Champ de Mars, following this, actually the radicals are on the back foot, aren't they? It's the constitutional monarchists that are in the ascendancy following the Champ de Mars massacre, and the radicals are forced to flee. Danton goes into hiding, and the assembly, the new legislative assembly, is actually dominated by constitutional monarchists. And we could say after the Journées of 1792, the assembly is pretty much powerless. They are kind of being dictated to by the Paris Commune, who are now dominated by the radicals. Remember, it's become an insurrectional commune in the summer of 1792. So it's been taken over by Jacobins, who are not in the Legislative Assembly, and it's in continuous session from the summer of 92. So they're always meeting. It's meeting all the time. They've got both the commune and the sections. So the commune has got a much bigger influence here. It's been taken over by radicals, and it is on the side of the sans-culottes, and they're forming quite a powerful alliance, aren't they? So it's the sans-culottes, the radical politicians, and the Paris Commune, who they dominate, that are all acting together, and the assembly is pretty powerless to stop them, isn't it? And the moderates actually flee. Not only do they flee the assembly, but Lafayette even flees France, doesn't he, after he tries to prevent this from happening. And ultimately, constitutional monarchy was maintained and remained, and they persevered with it after the Champ de Mars, but now it is at an end. Okay, so we're getting a real sense here, I hope, that that the power of the sans-culottes has increased. They are more angry against the monarchy. They are more determined against the monarchy, and that's in the context of the war and Louis's own actions in protecting who they see to be unpatriotic enemies of France. But their power has also increased because they have got this influence in the Paris Commune that they've taken over, and it's the Paris Commune that removes the monarchy, isn't it, in alliance with the sans-culottes. And I think the key thing here, and we'll talk about this in our live lesson, is the influence of war and how much of a hysterical situation this creates in the summer of 1792. And we'll come on to that a little bit more in a minute. So the final thing I want you to have a think about is, in what ways were the political events inside France being influenced by the progress of the war? Okay, so you've got a grid a little bit like this on your worksheet. Just have a little think about what you would say in answer to this question for a few minutes, and just try and write down a little thought. Why is the war important? Why does it heighten tensions in Paris? Okay, so you might have written something down about it heightening tensions, it heightening divisions between the people that were in favour of the revolution and those that were seen to be enemies of the revolution, like the refractory priests, increasingly the monarchy, and the defenders, therefore, of constitutional monarchy, like Lafayette. And I think the other key point, well, two other key things, is you've got the Fédérés. They would not have been such an influencing factor and radicalising and ultimately arming the sans-culottes had the war not been going on. And I think it's just the sort of atmosphere you get in the sort of August of 1792 in the context of the Brunswick Manifesto and this kind of threat to life and the fact that, you know, the army's 2 weeks away. It just creates this kind of sort of absolute hysteria, and this it kind of brings everything to a head, really. It sort of, you know, you get a sense that there's a view that now is the time for action rather than more talking. Okay, so we'll be talking more about the influence of war in the context of how important that is with other factors in the lesson tomorrow. Okay, so well done on completing these tasks. There's quite a lot of new information there, so there will be a quiz to do this week on this topic. What I'd also recommend is for you to watch these events on the film. Okay, so on the worksheet I've put the YouTube links to the film. For the second part of the film, which starts with the September massacres, you do need to put the subtitles on. So if you don't know how to do that, you could Google how to add subtitles on a YouTube film, and I'm sure it will tell you. Okay, but I would recommend watching this just to kind of consolidate what actually happened, because there's a lot of information there on what went on. Okay, so just to check that you've done everything, this is a kind of checklist of the things that you should have completed this lesson, and then we will be analysing the importance of these different factors in ending constitutional monarchy in our next live lesson on Tuesday the 23rd of February. Okay, well done, bye.